The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Wait, Tylor, I know what that means now.
Yeah, no, you really don't. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Tylor, your host who knows these books and is just absolutely thrilled that we finally got to my two favorite chapters in the history of fantasy literature. And I am joined by Greg, who last week talked a big talk about knowing what his own podcast title meant and really didn't know until this week. Greg, how does it feel to actually know what it means to go through the glass columns?
I don't know, Tylor. We'll see if by the end of the episode I have some understanding of what it means.
This week, of course, we are going to be discussing Chapter 25, The Road to the Spear, and Chapter 26, The Dedicated. Just wanted to get that in before you started talking about these wonderful chapters.
Feels good. I will say, I think I put in more prep for these two episodes than I have any other episode of the podcast. We'll see if that pays off or if I'm like worse tonight for some unknown reason. But my joke to you on text message, given recent events that are only slightly old, is it was so nice they let Christopher Nolan come in and write these two chapters of Wheel of Time, because I really felt like I was watching Memento is where my head was at, or perhaps Tenet.
Yeah, no, this is definitely the tone shift in this book, right? There is a moment where all of Wheel of Time has felt very kind of traditional fantasy, and I can distinctly remember being like 12, 13 years old reading these chapters for the first time and just being like, oh, I have not encountered something like this in any fantasy literature before. And it really kind of changed the way that I read fantasy going forward. I think before I had been kind of a casual observer who liked the cultures, and these were the chapters that really made me someone asking, and why is the culture like that in every kind of future fantasy book I read? And these chapters are amazing as far as I am concerned. Are you as blown away by them as I once was?
I'm going to hesitate to say blown away. I found them very intriguing, that it felt to me like I was watching a puzzle being kind of created. And, you know, I'm sure as our listeners, well, let's get our disclaimer out of the way. Listeners,
yes,
we are going to just talk about these two chapters together. So we know some of you like to read one, listen to that chapter, and then switch and read the other. The structure of these two chapters is that it's kind of one big continuous sweep. So we will break it up into fragments, kind of based on the plot and the structure of these two chapters, which even if you've just read one, I think you can understand what we mean by that. But we are going to kind of sweep through them all together. So if you haven't read both 25 and 26, pause here and go do that. And then we'll be right here when we come back. When you come back.
Anyways, now that those jerks are gone, like, let's talk about what happened, because, oh my God, this is the weirdest twist I've ever read in a book, right? It is something that is completely out of left field and happened thousands of years ago. And I don't entirely know how to square that, even a decade after reading this for the first time. Like, it's very different from any monumental, groundbreaking chapter I'm used to reading. Those are usually big plot moments. And this is, if anything, just a pile of world building.
Yeah, definitely. And so I would say it took me kind of two or three, let's call them fragments before I really understood what was going on. And I think, probably you can catch on after the second starts if you're really on top of things.
Mhm.
And then it became to me, and why I spent so much longer on note taking than I usually do. It's like I got to figure this thing out. And I don't think we'd had really any chapters in our journey through these books so far where I really felt like it took me an intense amount of like brain power to actually kind of unpuzzle these things.
Yeah.
I still think my hesitation is I don't feel like I 100% got what's going on here, and I'm really been looking forward to our discussion to clue me into to what I missed. But the idea that, to your point, this kind of culture that has been on the periphery, kind of coming towards the center, suddenly takes on this very central importance and feels like the kind of two chapters where if you really scrutinize these, you could kind of unlock the whole puzzle. There were episodes of Lost that always felt that way.
Yeah.
You'd get like these filler ones, and then you'd get a deep mythological one. You're like, oh, this was a big clue. And I would say that's exactly the feeling I felt in these chapters. I'm like, oh, I was just given a huge clue. I don't know if I understand the whole mystery yet.
Well, I hope then that what this episode can be is you asking the questions you have, because I want to do exactly the same thing with you that I do with my one student in every class who is too smart for the class. I'm like, if you don't understand anything, you must ask the question because everyone else in the class has 8 questions related to what you've just asked, right? So that is
And
your
they'll
job
never ask
today,
them on their
Greg.
own.
Exactly, right? You are the smart kid in class. You must ask the question.
All right, I'll do my best. And I am very, I just want to emphasize again, very excited. I know you've been counting down like weeks and weeks and weeks to this moment, and so I
Years
want to
and
embrace
years.
that enthusiasm. So we're gonna do our best to get through this. Real world, Tyler was sick last week, so I actually read these like a week and a half ago, and I'm getting increasingly nervous about my ability to recall anything in them. So I
Well,
think we should begin, Tyler, before we ramble more.
absolutely. As we mentioned before, we are going to be taking these one non-Rand POV at a time. The little Rand snippets I will include briefly. So Rand steps through the first column, wondering what it does. Ahead, he sees another Aiel, who he assumes is Muradin, who is snarling and angry at whatever he is seeing before his face. Suddenly, Rand sees Roydian being constructed. He recognizes that he is sometime in the past. Roydian is not yet as unfinished as it currently is, and he is kind of experiencing all of this from behind the eyes of Mandian, a Sept chief. And after a few moments, Rand is kind of no longer aware of himself as separate from Mandian. He is simply experiencing what this Aiel lived through. So he is here at the behest of what are known as the Gen Aiel, and they are referred to him as symbols of the lost ones. His wife, who is a dreamer, tells him that he must do whatever the Gen ask, and they are told that if any clan does not do what the Gen ask, they will all die out. He leads a troop of 100 into the city, all of them men, because he is concerned that the Maidens of the Spear may cause issues depending on what is asked. Eventually, he gets close enough to the city that he leaves the 100 and he advances towards the city, joined by chiefs from a number of other clans, noting that they have also heard from their wise ones that if they do not come, horrible things will happen in the future. There are 2 Aes Sedai there, as well as and he starts to think when he sees the Aes Sedai about kind of the ancient traditions and how much has been lost. And at that point, he thinks of his grandfather, Comran, and his grandfather's grandfather, Roderick, a hint that will become useful later on. A man then says that he will speak for the Gen and for Roydian. Mandian asks why they have been called, and he is asked why he does not wield a sword. None of the Aiel seem to know the real answer to that. They know it is against tradition, but they don't know why it is against tradition. And this is when they then hear the prophecy of the Karakarn, which I'm sure we will analyze in detail when we get to it. The Gen then say they seek no control over the Aiel, but what they want is that everyone who is going to become a clan chief must come to Roydion and step through the glass columns so that they can remember what has been lost. And if they do not come, then everything will be lost for their culture. All of the clan chiefs agree that they will go. Rand then emerges and is puzzled about who the Gen were and who the Aiel were. They seemed to be Aiel, but with no weapons. He then looks forward at Muradin, who is frowning, and he begins to take another step forward. So I guess if
All
each of
right.
these I'm going to be summarizing, I then want you to tell me what you got out of it and also what your questions were about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So where I would begin the questioning is this figure of Mauradin is going to continue to be this kind of refrain that Rand is going to take steps closer and closer to him.
Yes.
Where should we know him from prior to these moments, this chapter?
Yes. So a couple of chapters ago, when Rand first arrived in the Aiel Waste, he was confronted by an Aiel named Couladin, who was kind of contentious with him and with Ruark. Couladin was a member of the Shido Aiel, and we learned that his brother, Muradin, had gone into Roydian in order to become the clan chief of the Shido. So this is Couladin's brother, who likely entered Roydian maybe a day and a half ago, and so is ahead of Rand, but is clearly kind of struggling with the process of what he's going through.
So what comes to mind, and again, who knows when we are possibly recording this, is the film Dune Part Two. There's this way in which the now Rebecca Ferguson, whose character name I'm forgetting,
The Lady Jessica.
Lady Jessica has to become the religious leader, and so she takes drinks of the. Now I'm just spoiling Dune for no reason. So she has to go
It's only
undergo a
50
process.
years old.
She has to undergo a process in which she, in order to lead, has to be given the memories of an entire
Yeah.
back kind of history of these religious figures, passing on that knowledge and kind of carrying that burden. And that's what's coming to mind
Yeah.
here, that the process of entering the glass columns is, yes, it's a rite of passage in a literal sense, but what it really is coming to kind of full knowledge about the tribe and the tribe's history. I don't want to say tribe
Yeah.
because it's bigger than that. The people, the whole of the Aiel people.
I do
Is that an
actually.
apt comparison?
That is exactly apt. And in fact, the fact that you are highlighting the Bene Gesserit, who what they do is they gather the memories of all of their ancestors, that I think is exactly pertinent to what we're seeing here, because we are seeing all of these memories through a single male lineage, right? Everything is son to grandson to son all the way down. And so I think it's very reasonable to assume, given how much of this series has had like the old blood and memories from the past rising, that what the columns are doing is giving Rand access to his own lineage's history. And so I think that kind of is showing us like exactly what you're describing, tapping into that kind of ancient past of the family to experience kind of the history of the culture.
And we should understand also prior to this, there was a hint about Rand's father being
Yes.
not the father we know, but that we talked about perhaps a difference from the television show that his father was of the Aiel. And so well, wait. Anyway, now I have like 5 questions about that, but I'll bracket those. And so we are understanding that he is probably the end product of this line that we are going to continue to see
Yes.
as we go on here. But that is separate from Mauradin. There's no genetic connection between those two other than they're both Aiel.
Correct. So my presumption, and this is obviously not described in this, is that Muradin would be seeing the same events, but likely from his ancestors' perspective rather than Rand's ancestors' perspective. So he might not be seeing Mandian go to Roydian, but he is likely seeing from the eyes of one of the other clan chiefs who went to Roydian and agreed.
So then the other thing, and this is me, Greg, having read the whole chapter. So things that stand out in this fragment that we should be aware of.
Yep.
Clearly, the Gen Aiel are an
Yep.
important part of this story, and them as a particular clan within the larger Aiel people.
Yep.
We should be conscious of the lack of weaponry, which we will eventually learn is connected to the Way of the Leaf.
Yep.
And we should be surprised that the Aiel are so tied into the history of the Aes Sedai, right?
Yes.
That connection is not something we really know prior to this first kind of hint in this fragment, and then that will grow.
Yes, and I think that this actually helps explain something of a mystery in the previous chapter. So we were kind of wondering, where did all of these like artifacts, particularly things that seemed like ter'angreal and sa'angreal, where did they come from in Rhuidean? We now kind of get this hint it has something to do with this connection between the Aiel and the Aes Sedai, and then obviously we trace that back through the previous stories. We'll get to what that means in like a chapter or so. But yes, you're highlighting exactly, I think, the right details to be pulling out of here. I need to highlight one more thing from this section because I know that you are not going to pull out the prophecy. It is my job to make sure that we talk about the prophecy. We have heard quite a bit about the prophecies of the dragon, but I don't believe that we have actually gotten a whole lot yet about the Aiel prophecies. And so this is what we get. That one will come later. The stone that never falls will fall to announce his coming. Of the blood, but not
Fair.
raised by the blood, he will come from Rhuidean at dawn and tie you together with bonds that cannot break. He will take you back and he will destroy you.
Cool. Prophecies.
Thank you for that insightful discussion. I think it's the last line there that is new to us, right? We knew that Rand was the chosen one. We knew that he would come at some point, but he will take you back and he will destroy you. He will destroy you is new and interesting. He will take you back is fascinating in light of what back means by the end of this chapter.
Cool. Let's go to another fragment because we're on track to make this a 12-hour episode.
Which it probably should be. Let's be real. At this point, Rand is Roderick. So it is notable from what we learned in the previous chapter. This is 4 generations earlier. He and Jordam, a very old Aiel, watch a number of people who are digging wells and have gotten water out of it. He looks around and sees 3 armed men and thinks that soon he and the Gen must cross the dragon wall. Before they do, however, he steps out and talks to one of the armed men. It is someone who he has actually met before, and it seems to be the person who owns the well. Jordan asks whether or not they are still allowed to use the well as they have been allowed in the past, and they are told that yes, they are allowed to use the water. They are asked some questions about the Gen, and they simply respond that the Gen are the same and not the same. We also learn that the Aiel soon will cross because they are following Aes Sedai. They are asked how many Aes Sedai are with them, and we learn that there are 4. And when he's talking about the Aes Sedai, Roderick begins thinking about the stories that the old Aiel once failed the Aes Sedai, but he doesn't know how they failed them. Jordam says at this point that they are guarding the Gen Aiel, that they keep them safe, and the Aes Sedai seem ready to build a city somewhere else in the world. It's worth noting, interestingly, that's Tar Valon and gives us a good hint of where we are in the history of the world. We then hear from Roderick that everyone in the world is either an Aiel, a Gen, or an enemy. And Rand steps forward. There's nothing exciting about that Rand narration. Of all of the pieces, this I think is the shortest and the one that maybe has the least obvious relevant details to pull out. But I think if we dig way back, this is actually a meaningful scene. What did you think about this one? Any questions you had here?
So they one of the places they're looking at is they are talking about crossing the spine of the world.
Yes.
And I'm thinking they are talking about moving west. They are in the Far East looking to move west across the spine?
No,
or the other way?
opposite. So they are in the west, where most of the characters are, and what we are seeing is the moment where the Aiel entered the waste and more or less haven't
When they
left
left.
since. Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. That's a good clarification. And I did have down in my notes to ask, because it felt like this could be the building of Ruidian or Tarvalon. So you said it should be understood as the Aes Sedai have worked with the Aiel, but now that the Aiel are leaving, the Aes Sedai are going to go build Tarvalon.
Yeah, so it's worth
And talk
noting.
me through what that time period is that you
Yes.
referenced in your summary.
So what we are learning here is two important things. One is that the Aes Sedai with the Gen are not the only Aes Sedai, and that other Aes Sedai elsewhere are the ones who are building a city. That's our hint that they're not building Roidion. That would be the Gen, the Aiel, or the Aes Sedai who are with the Gen. The other Aes Sedai are building a city, therefore Tarvalon. Now, what does that mean in terms of time frame? That puts this event at approximately 3,000 years before the events of the book that we are currently reading. So Tarvalon was one of the first cities that was established after the breaking of the world. So that establishes this snippet as being at the very end of the breaking. That puts everything that happens before this in, that comes, I guess, next in this chapter, is happening during the breaking of the world. And then what that means is that when we are looking 4 generations later, that first story we heard is maybe like 2,800 years ago. So it's been a long time that the Aiel have been coming to Roidian. This is ancient past at this point.
Cool. That's what I have. But you just said tantalizing things that we need to talk about in future fragments.
Yeah. So actually tantalizing things from like 2.5 books ago is what I want to talk about.
Mm.
So we here are getting an interaction that is peaceful between the Aiel and, as you noted, the kingdom that is immediately to the west of the spine of the world. I believe that that would be Cairhien, if I'm reading my map correctly. And so we had earlier, I believe in the first book, there was a lot of kind of intrigue around what was the cause of the Aiel War. Why did they come across the spine of the world? Why did they attack Cairhien in particular? Why did they wait to do so until after the king had cut down a tree of life in order to make his throne? Well, now we kind of know the beginning of that story, even if we don't entirely know the middle and the end. Right? It seems that the Aiel closeness with the Cairhien prior to that was a result of them being willing to share water during the breaking when no one else would. And it seems at some point, in order to repay that debt, they gave one of their 3 trees of life to the king of Cairhien. And so him cutting it down was a horrific insult to them. So we're still
Mm.
missing a lot of details here, but one kind of long-standing, what was going on there? I think we're seeing the ancient origins of that story.
Cool. Helpful.
That's all I got for this one. I think we mostly needed to establish the generations passing before we jumped even further back in time.
But we're not going that far back this time, right?
That's correct. We are now, I believe, 2 generations. So this is Roderick's grandfather. We are now in the head of Jordan. So it is the winter, although there have been no real changes in the seasons during Jordan's kind of extended life. He asks the Gen if they need them, and they tell Jordan that he has given up the way. He denies this, saying that he has never held a sword, and the Gen ask him to follow them. He follows them to their camp, and there he sees Lewin, an older Aiel, and who tells them that the Gen have been attacked. Many of the Gen have been taken captive. Lewin promises to go and bring them back from the people who have taken them captive, and he invites a number of the Gen to come with them to reclaim their captives. He says that if they do come, however, they will never be invited back to the wagons. A few of them do, but most notably Morin, a woman, chooses to take up one of the spears and agrees that she will fight to get her daughter back. He teaches her how to dress in order to stay camouflaged and wear the Cadden Sore. He teaches her how to use a spear for battle, and he breaks her spear, creating a short spear, allowing her to attack more nimbly and setting a number of what will become the traditions of the maidens of the spear. Her husband cares more for the trees of life than their daughter, and so he is not coming along. And she says that now the spear is her husband. And he, that is Jordan, then thinks to himself how anyone could take the way of the life so seriously when things like this are going on around them. Rand is confused at this.
So this is classic movie prequel stuff, right? Like this is, hey, you've really liked the kind of mythology around the spear maidens, maidens of the spear. So we'll show you exactly why they were formed in this particular way. It's also at this moment that I start thinking a lot more about the Tinkerers
Yeah,
because we have a wagon train, we have the Way of the Leaf, and we have, kind of these similarities to how this group is traveling about it. It starts to feel more like them. So I would say those things were in the mix. I think where I'm still confused is we are now seeing people, we are being told that the Gen are the ones that follow the Way of the Leaf, or the
that is
Gen are those
correct.
that don't.
The Gen
So the first
follow the
one.
way of the leaf, and then Jordam, who is not a Gen Aiel, uses spears but not swords in battle.
So 2 generations later with Roderick, we are seeing this breaking is now like separate tribes, essentially.
Yeah, I don't even know at this point we may consider them separate tribes, right? In the same way that, like, if someone who is among the Tinkerers were to take up a sword, they would basically be banished from the wagons. It seems that the Aiel, as we now know them, travel with the Gen, but consider themselves separate, right? I think it was in the previous
Okay.
section where they were called the Gen are Aiel and not Aiel, was the way that it was described.
Hmm. And that is because the main Aiel, what you're denoting with Aiel,
Yeah.
so embrace fighting and war and weaponry and so
Exactly.
on.
Yeah. So
Okay.
the
Okay.
distinction between the Gen and the, I guess, traditional Aiel, if you will, is that
Yeah.
whether or not they follow the way of the leaf.
Cool. What did I not catch?
You're doing pretty good here. I mean, I think a lot of what's going on here is just little details about Morin and all of the small things that become traditions for the Maidens of the Spear, right? The short spear,
Yeah.
the dress. This is also the first time I think that we get reference to Aiel wanting to keep their hair short so that they can have their faces seen, which is something that we've seen all of the Aiel, if they want to wear long hair, it's always in a tail at their back, and so we see a little bit of that tradition kind of evolving here. I don't know. The spear is her husband now, and yet she seems very interested in Jordan. Feels too on the nose to not mention with the Maidens of the Spear, but I think you're right. This is all of the this is Chewie showing up at the end of the third Star Wars movie. It is completely unnecessary, but it's kind of awesome, right?
Mm.
Let's go to
I get
Lewin.
it.
So Lewin is adjusting his.
this
Oh, please.
this is the Lewin we just had mentioned,
That's
right?
correct. He was very old
So
in
these
the
are
previous, and he is
right.
young here. So again, 1 or 2 generations, probably.
Cool.
Lewin adjusts his dust veil. He notes that there is no water available during the day except for the children, and there are a number of others who are with him, 4 others, and they're looking down on a camp where a number of their relatives have been taken. They note that the other Aiel would not approve of what these 5 are about to do. They plan to sneak the girls away, and one of the and as they try to get close, they sneak up, and one of the men rises, threatening them. They're unable to run. They can't get the girls away quickly enough, and in kind of a panic, Lewin takes up a spear and he stabs a man. And as he looks around, all of his other friends have also killed someone, although one of them has fallen. They gather up the girls. They all seem afraid of the boys who have just done killing, and they return to their families. As soon as they arrive, the girls announce what they have done, and they are promptly banished by their families. They are told that there is no justification for doing violence. There is no reason to go against the way of the leaf. And as they are being sent away, it is Lewin's mother who tells him to hide their faces because no one who has a face of their son should be a killer. This is, of course, the origin of the Aiel wearing veils when they do battle. We then have Lewin insisting in his head that he is Aiel, and then Rand begins to think on this and what it means. Well, it appears that Muradin wants to flee, but Rand continues to go forward and back. And it's that last phrase I just want to highlight because the reason this podcast is called Through the Glass Columns is because forward and back felt like the perfect metaphor for what we do every week on this show.
Hmm. Look at that. So and then I just want to make sure I'm putting these two, connecting these two puzzle pieces. So then Lewin in the next one is the one who says, we need to train you to go get your daughter, right?
Yes.
So he's kind of the dark side influence in the next fragment, but here we're understanding this came from essentially a good place
Yeah.
of we want to save these women, and so they had to, and ended up committing violence and breaking the way of the leaf. And I think you said this, but I zoned out for just a second there. When he comes back and is condemned and bandaged, that is Adon, who will be the next fragment, right?
I believe so. Yes.
Yes. Okay. I think, yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
The one thing I want to highlight here, which really struck me on this reading that I hadn't noticed before, is just how quickly the tradition of Aiel using spears but not swords became ingrained and the origins became forgotten. Right? We are likely looking
Mm.
at like 30 to 40 years between this segment and the previous one. And yet, during that time, Lewin is debating with himself in this fragment whether or not he is Aiel. And by 30, 40 years later, Jordam, either his son or grandson, is debating whether or not the Gen are Aiel.
Mm. I see. Yeah.
Questions or thoughts you had here?
No, I'm still, I mean, what I'm puzzling on is how the way of the leaf became so prominent. And I like what you just said, that it's then like it's this quick flip, like, and that feels true to life,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I in American politics, it always reminds me when Republicans are quick to be like, we're the party of Abraham Lincoln. And it's like, oh, hold up, kind
Yeah.
of, but let's work on that a little bit. Or, you know, and on the flip side, Democrats forget that it was the Democrats in the South mainly
Yep.
doing the Jim Crow laws and so on. We kind of forget that that flip of the two parties happens in the wake of the Civil Rights Act. And
Yeah.
so while I like your point, and I don't know that I appreciate it on my own, it's also, it's like it's natural. Like 30
Yeah.
to 40 years, you just forget and you just swap and you make something your identity there. So
Yeah.
so at this fragment, we have that Lewin is uh up until the moment revealed in this chapter, following the way of the leaf,
Yeah.
which makes him feel like Aiel, but then it's the Gen later who will not feel like Aiel. Okay.
Exactly. And I believe we are meant to believe here that Lewin is then the first Aiel who breaks the way of the leaf, and all who come after him are descended from one of those five, presumably.
Okay.
Um, I don't really have a ton to say here other than I think the explanation of we don't use swords, they can only kill, whereas spears can be used for hunting and providing, I think is an interesting nuanced read that I wasn't right. We start this chapter with that being the mystery. Why don't we use swords? And it's a satisfying answer, I guess, is really all I have to say about this, right? We obviously have another 4 or 5 flashbacks before we get the fullest of the stories of what's going on with the Way of the Leaf. But why spears and not swords? I'm pretty happy with that payoff 20 pages later. Does that work for you, I guess, is the question I'm asking?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I will say outside of this book, I don't necessarily think of spears and swords that way, but I take it as, you know, not that big a logical leap.
Yeah.
Certainly, you know, and again, tell it to me like it's Star Wars, is, you know, that is often what the kind of mythology of the lightsaber is, that the
Yeah.
lightsaber can be used for defense as well as attack. So the spear here is not being set up as a defensive mechanism, but something that is a tool more than it is a weapon.
Yeah. Absolutely. We are then jumping into chapter 26, The Dedicated. I don't know that we needed that because we are just going POV by POV, but if you're following along, new chapter. Rand is now Adon, Lewin's grandfather. Wagons burn around him, and there are dead lying all around. Armed men are carrying off many of the women from the group, and his wife has been killed. Adon is arguing with a number of other Aiel, insisting that they go on, while other argue that they have nothing but the Aes Sedai carts anymore. They have no food. They have nothing to help them survive. And basically, Adon seems extremely surprised that all of these people are potentially willing to give up on traveling with the carts. But it's worth noting that the person who seems to be leading the group away, someone named Sulwyn, says that he plans to abandon the wagons, but he plans to do so while continuing to follow the way of the leaf, and he hopes to find a place of safety where the Aiel can once again sing. Adon notes then that the Aiel songs have been lost long ago, but Adon says that they are no longer Aiel. Just because they follow the way of the leaf does not mean that they must continue to follow the carts and what the Aes Sedai gave them. Adon wonders whether or not being faithful is worth it, and he whispers to himself and seemingly to his children that they are still faithful. Rand then ponders to himself that because he knows that the Way of the Leaf is not an Aiel tradition, he knows it as something that the Tinkers do, and he looks ahead and sees Muradin howling and beginning to scratch at his own face. That's a bunch of stuff that happened there. Now we're getting into the deep history. What did we think of this, which seems to be the origins of the Tinkers?
Yes. So much more central to what's going on than I would have expected, right? And there were those hints. I've already invoked them already here, but we are understanding Way of the Leaf, Wagon Train feels a part of this. Now, I think I had misunderstood this as a wagon train headed to what will become Ruidian, but that is thousands of years from now, right? That's
Right.
all the way back to the first fragment that Ruidian is a new city. So we're very far before that would be there. So this is better understood as just this is how these people, these Aiel, traveled the world.
That is how we are meant to take it at this point in the story,
I see.
right? By
And
the
we're in the main continent too. That was my other
Yes.
question. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, a
Okay.
couple things worth noting. One, this is during the breaking of the world. So, we are on the main continent, but the main continent is in flux, right? I think it's in the next segment that we have a character looking over a mountain thinking there used to be a city there, and he's looking at an ocean, right? That's the level of, upheaval that we're dealing with here. The other thing that I think it's important to note here is that at this point, we seem to have wagons that we are told have used to have supplies and all of the like ways of getting around that you're describing. But after these raiders have come, now all that is on them is what the Aes Sedai gave to them. So we are given to understand that the following what 8 to 12 generations probably that occurred in the previous chapter, that all was done not with the wagons serving any real living purpose, but solely carrying whatever was given to the Aiel by the Aes Sedai. So I think that to some degree is the break, right? Is prior to this, the wagons were kind of both tinker style wagons and carrying the Aes Sedai equipment. And when all of the things that you could use to live out of a wagon happened, that is when the Tinker split, and only the ones who stayed faithful to carrying the Aes Sedai goods continued to call themselves Aiel.
And we are not sure what's on the wagons, but I've been kind of assuming it's all these Tarian Grial, Grials that are in Ruidian.
Exactly. That's the presumption, right? I think at the end of this chapter, we are told that the Aes Sedai gave these things into the safekeeping of the Aiel. We'll talk about exactly why when we get there. But yes, I think it is very, very likely that the objects that are scattered around Roidion are what are on these carts.
Okay. That's what I got for this one.
Excellent. Did I have anything else for this one? Is a very reasonable question to ask. Um, No, although I will say I was not expecting when I first read this for the song to be the through line of this second chapter, right?
Mm.
If the first chapter is about why the sword, then the second chapter is about why the song. And that is a really interesting story we're about to get. Let's jump into the head of Jonai, who stands on a cliff thinking that there should be a city on the other side of it, and instead there is a sea. He thinks on how few people and wagons there are left with the Aiel, and he then talks to and meets a young Adan, our narrator from the previous section. He thinks that too many men are still channeling, and that these men are kind of still causing upheaval all around the world. And as he looks ahead, he sees that there are a number of Ogier who have joined the group. They have a conversation about what is going on around them. They know that the blight is coming in from the south with a number of Trollocs, that there are significant problems I believe, from the east is where the Aiel have come, and they have found raiders. There are kind of problems all around, it seems. We also learned that recently an Aes Sedai visited the Aiel. She did a bunch of healing for a number of the Aiel, took several Sa'angreal, and then left. And when asked whether there was a place of safety nearby, she only laughed. We also learned the news from the Ogier that one of the Forsaken may only have been partially trapped. And then we also see that the Aiel are willing to share their food with the Ogier, even as Jonai thinks that people are going to go hungry in his own camp because the Ogier are being fed. Um, at this point, the Ogier ask whether there is a steading that they know about, and they note beginning to feel a longing that they don't think they will make it if they don't get to a steading soon. They also think that people no longer recognize the Aiel as Dashane, and the Ogier seem to think that it is absurd that anyone would harm a Dashane. At this point, Jonai begins to have a heart attack and tells his son to take the people south and to stay to the way of the leaf and to stay dedicated. Rand then begins to wonder how these people are Aiel, and ahead of him he sees Muradin screaming, and he is now scratching out his eyeballs. That's gross, but the rest of this section is kind of oddly beautiful. It's interesting to see the Ogier during the breaking of the world. What did we think about this, and what questions did we have?
So the wagons are being led to Kamal. Is that I have that
Well,
name in my notes?
so that was the city that it seems they were going to go to, and then Jonai is looking over and seeing that there is a sea instead.
I see.
I think what it becomes apparent by the end of this segment that the Aiel are looking kind of for any place of safety or security. And so my guess is they were hoping that known city would be one, and it is just not there anymore.
And so we should take this as, we've gone one step back in time. And so this is the moment where they take on the way of the leaf.
Uh,
Or, well, maybe not. It's assured that it becomes kind of a sacred vow. It does come up in the next one. Spoiler alert for 2 minutes from now.
yeah,
So we're seeing that this is still a central tenet.
absolutely. Yeah. So it seems at this point, not only do the Aiel follow the way of the leaf, but the Ogier, who it is notable, tend to have longer memories than the average human, but they seemed to take it as like a presumption that everyone would know that Aiel follow the way of the leaf. And they seem affronted at the idea that anyone would even kind of think about harming what they refer to as Dashane, but they seem to be referring to the Aiel. So this is kind of the difference there is I think in the previous segments, it was the Aiel thought of themselves as following the way of the leaf, and then eventually they become the Gen follow the way of the leaf. Here, it seems like there's almost a presumption that everyone should know they follow the way of the leaf and should leave them alone as a result of it, but that seems to have broken down in Jonai's experience, right? The Ogier seem to think that must be the case, and it isn't anymore.
And Daishane gets invoked here in this fragment and in the next fragment. I'm
Yeah.
right in remembering that is still present in Aiel culture. That is the like servants, right? Isn't that Daishane?
They are Guy Shane. So it is the same
Oh.
root word. I believe Dashane got thrown out by Moraine, possibly. I think it's another similar to, I think Jen was, I think we said Aiel was dedicated. Jen was the only true dedicated. And then I think later on we have them referred to as Dashane Aiel, which I think is like something honor and then dedicated. So
Okay.
it's the same root word but different.
Okay. Uh, and then just here, I mean, it seems to me what's important here is as the father is dying, this kind of blood oath, like,
Yeah.
it's Qui-Gon dying and saying, you must train the boy. It's like, keep the gifts safe. So
Yeah.
the dedication we see becomes so important over the next 1,000 years across these fragments we've been reading,
Yeah.
kind of comes back to this moment. And I'll just say, I like that. I understand people who probably have a different relationship to organized religion
Yeah.
might be critical of that, but I do think there are all these things in our culture that go back to some tiny little instant or tiny little
Yeah.
this happened to go that way and then becomes ritual and then becomes sacred belief in some way.
Well, and I think that that's really especially notable because what we have is Jonai tells his son Adon to take them south and guard the wagons. Adon teaches his grandson that there is nothing more important than protecting the wagons, and it is his grandson who is the first ever willing to do violence to protect the wagons. I think that really illustrates that idea of like little things expanding as the generations go on. I think you've hit the nail on the head there.
Cool. I get an A for the day. Thank you,
Yeah.
everybody. Through the glass columns. Oh, no,
Told
wait, we've
you
got some
you
more.
were the best student in the class. Two other quick hits
Also the
here.
worst.
Accurate. Two other quick hits here. One, I think it is very interesting that an Aes Sedai did arrive and not only didn't help them, but just took some stuff and pieced out. I feel like that tells us where we are at in terms of the breaking of the world and what it means for people's kind of willingness to do good things for each other. The other really fascinating hint we get here, this is taking place apparently after the Forsaken have been sealed, but we learn that some believe that one of the Forsaken may have only been partially sealed. And this actually lines up really well with a couple of things that we had Baelzamon spouting for 3 whole books. He kept being like, I was driving the world. I was the one who whispered horrible things into Arthur Hawkwing's ear. I was the general of the Trolloc Wars. Well, we later on learned that Baelzamon was one of the Forsaken, and if one of the Forsaken was partially sealed, they very well could have done all of those things that Baelzamon was claiming. So if Ishamael is the Forsaken who was only partially sealed in this chapter, that actually resolves a lot of how was the Dark One there kind of weird hints we had gotten at several points in the first 3 books.
That makes sense to me. And your comment on just being non sequitur here, it's reminding me now I really understand the comparison I should have been making from the beginning. This is the magician's nephew of this book
Yeah.
series, right? Where suddenly you're like, oops, we accidentally put a piece of lamppost here, and then generations later it'll be this is Narnia for people who don't know the reference. That's what this is, right? It's
Yeah.
that helps me, right? That we are meant to kind of understand small bits of chance that occurred that become these cultures in these worlds as a part of that. Okay, so I got all that. That sounds good to me. And you had one other because you said 2, or is that it?
I think by 2 were the Aes Sedai visiting and the Forsaken being partially.
Okay.
Uh, we
All
are
right.
then, interestingly enough, still in Jonai's head, but probably 60-ish years earlier, we are given to believe. So a young Jonai runs through a shattered and burning city. He is wearing a Cadansor, which he refers to as his work clothes, and he thinks of himself as being 63 and thus too young for gray hairs, which as someone who started getting gray hairs in their early 20s, I hate this man. He sees several Aes Sedai, and they have both Kalendor and the Dragon Banner, and he begins thinking about why they have not destroyed the Dragon Banner, given the horrible things that the dragon did. The Aes Sedai then begin discussing an unclear foretelling and asking how they can do things even if they don't know when they are going to happen. Jonai begins ignoring them, much to my dismay. I want to know more about it. And then he begins talking to a Nym, who, from the description, we are given to believe is a green man. Jonai knows him, but the Nim seems injured or damaged in some way and doesn't seem to remember him in return. Someshta seems to be the Nim's name. He calls Jonai a child of the dragon, and Jonai flinches at that. The Aes Sedai then ask whether or not all is ready, and Jonai says yes. He says that some of the Aiel would like to stay in the city, which, by the way, is named Paradisen, which is a wonderful little Easter egg. And then they mention a story for why they should not stay. The story of how 10,000 Aiel held hands and sung a song to try to stop a mad Aes Sedai from destroying a city. They did not. All 10,000 were killed by the Aes Sedai, but actually, the our narrator is actually really proud of this. He says that many people were able to escape the city in the time that was bought by those Aiel who were doing their singing. The Aes Sedai make him a promise to continue to keep to the way of the leaf. He says, of course he would, although it is noted in the narration that his father seems to have turned to violence at one point or another. The Aes Sedai seemingly are about to create the Eye of the World from the description that we get from them. And then they say that they must keep some Angreal away from the madmen, and that seems to be what the Aiel are being tasked with. They are given a number of the most powerful items and are told to keep it away until a place of safety can be found where none who are insane can get a hold of it. He then said dreams of everything or then he mentions that his wife has had a dream of everything being well, although it is long, long in the future. As we come into Rand's head, he now sees that Muradin has completely removed his eyeballs. Once again, super gross. Thoughts about our second Jonai?
Keep it secret, keep it safe, right? Seems to be okay. So we get the beginning of that trail. That the point was that there are in the breaking of the world, there are mad people running around, specifically mad men.
Yeah, so the
yes?
breaking of the world is the moment when channeling started to make men go insane. And so them not
Okay.
knowing it, there were thousands of men who were channeling, and they caused the breaking of the world in their madness.
Okay. And so I'm really picking up the last piece there. So that then starts the wagon train, these
Yeah.
things that now are sitting around a man potentially going mad inside the glass columns and his weird buddy who we might catch up with in a little bit. Uh, and more than anything, I would just say what stood out to me is this chapter. There are these literal aftershocks of the breaking of the world, and that just seems to be like, take this. Like everything happening here is the immediate aftershocks of this breaking of the world. The continent is feeling it. The peoples are feeling it. I like what you said about the Aes Sedai are clearly starting to piece together how they need to place things in order to set up the next kind of revolution of the wheel. But in this moment, it's all kind of chaotic and so on. So they are all Daishane at this point, which means they are sacred honored, and the way of the leaf is already a part of them. So those start here and kind of start this kind of covenant that they're going to follow that forward, which we then see break. I think that's all I have in my notes for this fragment.
Yeah, I just need to note the beauty of the story of the 10,000 Aiel. As someone who is a pacifist myself, like I kind of agree they did the right thing. I also just want to note how I think Robert Jordan does a really fantastic job in this section of giving you everything you need to know that these are the Aes Sedai who will create the Eye of the World, and never quite completely laying it out, right? He puts all of the objects that are in the Eye of the World on the table. He talks about a prophecy and things that need to be. He talks about the Green Man. All of these things are in there, but never once do we hear the name of the first book. And so if you're not looking, I think it's pretty easy to miss what these Aes Sedai are doing. They're planning on putting the sword in the stone and then creating the Eye of the World.
And there you go. There's the magician's nephew directly, right? Like let's link back to the start of the saga and build that up. Cool.
We are now in the head of Cumin. He is working in a
one of my favorite spices.
It is delicious. Uh,
Sorry, go ahead.
he is working in a field of, which seems to have a large amount of advanced technology. He references what looks like metal beetles flying in the sky, and I've recently seen Dune, so I can definitely imagine what that would look like. He describes a number of kind of advanced technologies. He notes that he has heard stories that once there were no soldiers and no shadow and no war. His father, Charn, even tells stories that once Lanfear was not always evil. He then sees a Nim who begins to make seeds grow as it walks by. And once the Nim has gotten into place, a number of Ogier begin singing, and then the Aiel also begin singing. And as they do, an entire crop sprouts and then grows fully in seemingly a matter of minutes. The Kuman basically seems to think like this is the dream. He loves his life as he is doing this. Soon a soldier approaches, looking extremely weary, and asking if basically asking if he has news, what is going on in the world. The soldier tells them that Luz Theron has sealed the bore, that the Dark One and all of the Forsaken are sealed, and the soldier is basically announcing that the war is over. Everyone seems to celebrate and everyone seems very excited, but then very quickly someone punches Kuman. He says that now that Lanfear will no longer protect them, people can actually get revenge on the Aiel. Basically, it seems that people think that they have been supporting the Forsaken. And then he drops a reference to the other one who has been taken care of. Kuman realizes that this is his father. He runs home and he realizes that his father, Charn, has been hung. And he thinks, why? We are Dashane.
So this is I wrote this in my notes as this is the breaking of the world, but that is not accurate. This is just prior to the breaking of the world.
The moment that the Dark One was sealed is the moment that men began to go mad. So I'm not sure at this moment whether this would be the beginning of the breaking of the world or just before the breaking of the world, right? I'm not sure how advanced we are in the madness tearing the world apart, but very, very close to the beginning.
And I mean, obviously, the headline here is getting Luz Theron, which we understand to be Rand of that generation. And I also noted, although you didn't mention it in your summary, I don't think it was him and his companions. I was like, oh, he has friends. Like, yeah, they're going to build a team. Go ahead.
I will actually note for longtime readers of this, Luz Theron and his companions are actually referenced earlier in the chapter. This is not the first time or the last that Rand or one of his ancestors will bring 100 people to an important meeting. It actually happens a couple times in these flashbacks.
Interesting. And then Shaiol Ghul stood out to me as well because that is where the sealing happened, where the defeat happened, right?
Yes.
And where the Forsaken are locked up.
That's correct.
And then that's all I have.
Okay. Then I need to pull out the big one here. Charn, who is Kuman's father, says that once there were no soldiers, there was no shadow, there was no war. All of that feels like pretty solid, like stuff we should experience, especially when we are in the city of Paradisen, right? If it's paradise, there's no war. But then he says Charn claimed that Lanfear was not always evil. And that name immediately set off warning bells for me, right? We know Lanfear was one of the Forsaken and thus active during the War of Shadow. And so the fact that Charn knows Forsaken, I think knows Lanfear, is a really important note to have as we then enter our last flashback. It's also worth noting this is, I think, our first sign of the breakdown of people respecting the Dashane, right? In the previous flashback, the Ogier were like, how could anyone disrespect an Aiel? They are Dashane, you do not harm them. This seems to be the beginning of that break. It was the fact that the Aiel seemed to side with the Aes Sedai, and that included a number of the Forsaken, that caused a lot of people to seem to have this kind of resentment for those who served one of the Forsaken prior to the breaking. And then we go to Charn. Charn is in a city with advanced technology. There are planes, there are cars, there are all sorts of things around. He thinks that soon he will marry and he will have to leave the city and move elsewhere. He is serving a woman named Mierin, but he will leave her service and go into someone else's service. A man bumps him and is extremely rude until his wife points out that he is Aiel. And as soon as that happens, the man immediately becomes extremely apologetic. And it's very clear that Charn is kind of dismissing any possibility that he could be harmed. And he's worried because many people kind of treat Dashane as if they're made of glass. They don't want to do any harm to them in any way because they know that the Dashane are so peaceful and will never harm anyone in response. At this moment, he feels the ground ripple around him and he begins rushing towards where he was going. He knows that Mierin had found a source of power beyond either Saidin or Saidar, and today was the day that she was going to tap into it. Then he sees chaos erupt in front of him, an explosion, darkness, horrific things, and people screaming all around him. And then Rand realizes he has seen the Dark One be broken out of his prison. We'll stop there before we go into the Rand section of this chapter. What did you make of this last flashback?
So this is the Charn who was hanged in
Yep.
the last one. So I think I'm having some timey-wimey brain on this one that is difficult. So this is the Dark One being broken out of his prison
Yep.
by this power that is bigger than the Saidin Saidar.
I believe the Dark One is the power that is bigger than Saidin Saidar.
I see.
And so when Mierin tapped into it, she released the Dark One inadvertently.
And so that then suggests how long between these last two? Because then he's captured again by when we get to Cumin.
So this is the problem. We now know that the entirety of the War of Shadow happened during Charn's lifetime. Right? Charn is a young man when the Dark One is released, and Charn dies as an old man when the Dark One is sealed. The reason that I struggle to say, and that means this was 50 years, is that we learned 2 flashbacks ago that the technology in this era is so advanced that 63-year-olds are far too young to have gray hairs. And so this all happens in Charn's lifetime, but if Charn's lifetime is 300 years, this is a really long war, right? And so that's the only uncertainty that I have here is the last 3 advanced technology flashbacks seem to suggest that with that technology, people lived longer. And so I know this all happens in 1 generation, but I don't know how long a generation is at that time.
Well, and so my main reaction to this first one was like, okay, so this is finally getting back to what the television show has teased from, I think, literally the first or second scene, which is the very, very advanced civilization that is in ruins by the time of the start of Eye of the World, roughly speaking, on the television strand. So I guess my question now is, he knows Mierin. We also know that she was Lanfear. Is there a connection between those two? So are they the same?
This is not, I think, a solid 100% guarantee as it is in the text. But Charn served Lanfear. Mierin was seemingly Charn's only person who he served until he was going to transition service with his wife. Unless he did transition service and this other name was Lanfear, I think we are led to believe, A, that Mierin is Lanfear, and B, that means Lanfear literally let the Dark One out of his prison.
Which kind of ranks her up higher than we might have previously had her there. So seemingly Lanfear figures out there's a bigger power than Saidin Saidar, unlocks the Dark One. The Dark One then has a generation in which he wreaks havoc, only to then be brought down by Lews Therin, and then starting a sequence that creates madness for men, which then drives the Aiel
Yes.
into becoming essentially the Tinkerers, and then on to becoming who they are today, on to creating the city where these sacred Sangreal, Terangreal are being stored. And Rand is now standing here as the inheritor of all this history, as a member of the Aiel who can date back to that time, seemingly.
Yeah, you got it. Write me 5 to 7 pages, at least 3 peer-reviewed sources. You're going to pass the class.
Oh, you had to say those words because I've just been spending all day being like, not peer reviewed. The New York Times is not peer reviewed. We talked about this. GoodRx.com is not peer reviewed. But on and on and on. So, all right. I feel a lot more confident. So we should take these two chapters. I'm probably am being preemptive. What else do we need to pick up from that fragment before I go to general level?
We don't need to pick up anything else from that fragment, but I do want to make sure we mention the Rand and Matt fragment. I am happy to
Right.
do recap of all of the other stuff and then move on to that. So, last thoughts on the entirety of our trip through the glass columns.
So I would say the podcast. All right. So it started with Tylor harassing me. No, um so I would say I'm understanding these two chapters as our opportunity to understand that the Aiel are perhaps the center of this story in a way, or towards the center of this story in a way we hadn't expected previously.
Yeah.
And so I'm understanding now Rand being the kind of figure of prophecy from kind of traditional continent, and the Aiel is kind of more of a reunion back to what
Yeah.
this society was, as instead of, some kind of path elsewhere. I then am kind of taking this to be our first big clue. Again, television show aside, that's kind of the only way I'm breaking this.
Yeah.
Our first big clue that we had an extremely advanced society. You've
Yeah.
pointed out as we've gone kind of little hints that you as a repeat reader can pick out. But this is really telling us that no, you need to think about the future from where you are, dear reader.
Yeah.
Some, beautiful future where they can walk through and plant crops and sing songs and all that stuff. And that future falls apart and becomes this kind of medievally seeming society on its
Yeah.
way back forward. And again, I'm trying to tiptoe around the television show as pieced other pieces of that together, but we'll set that aside.
Absolutely. I just want to add one more piece to this, right? I think at this point you have got the through line, like all of the details are there. You're seeing all of the interesting seeds of the culture that are placed all throughout this. I want to throw in one last detail, which I think we'll have to grapple with later on, but I just want to kind of get it on your and the other listeners' radar. 3 chapters ago, we got a bit of an overview of modern Aiel culture, and it was based primarily around Gieto, the idea that Aiel believe very strongly in debt and obligation and honor, that when something they do is wrong, they make up for it, right? And we learn that this is so important in their culture that if you do something dishonorable, you make up for it by becoming Gai Shane. You give up all of your freedoms for a year and a day to prove that you have enough honor. I want to take that lesson and put it in the context of Muradin, a man who was so crushed by the original sin of his culture that he chose to die rather than live with that dishonor. And that, I think, is the context going forward that we want to recognize. This is the secret Aiel history for a reason. In a culture that believes in making up for debts in the way that they do, an entire culture that gave up on the way of the leaf feels like a devastating origin story, given how kind of profoundly they think about making up for the wrongs that they've done.
Okay. So the sin is quitting pacifism.
Yeah.
Not because at first when you were building that, I thought you were saying their sin was Lanfear, but Lanfear's sin is separate,
Yeah,
as is
so.
always the case.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So Matt didn't seem like he was in as bad shape as I expected him to be.
Yeah.
But we'll see, right? So what do you want to say about that fragment?
I think we've just got, first off, let's just do the recap very, very quickly, right? So Rand emerges from the glass columns. He thinks about what is going on and that what he has just seen. And then he looks up and sees Matt hanging from a tree. He pulls him off of it. He realizes that Matt has a very faint heartbeat, and then he begins doing CPR, which I didn't know existed in Randland until this very minute. And he does manage to revive Matt. At this point, he notes that Matt has an odd spear that seems to have a short sword at the end of it as opposed to a normal spear point. And he also has a silver medallion that appears to have, I believe, a fox with the eye of being a ruby. We also note, I believe it is Matt who reads this, there is some text on his spear. Thus is our treaty written, thus is agreement made. Thought is the arrow of time, memory never fades. What was asked is given, the price is paid. Matt refers to this as a joke, and then the two begin to make their way off before they're attacked by dust monsters for no reason. That takes up about a page, and then they leave, realizing that they are about to arrive with the dawn. Mostly, I think we need to talk about the gifts that Matt got because he didn't die and seems to have gotten something for his time through. But I'm not sure how any of these two objects in any way are the three wishes, if you will, that Matt had asked for in the previous chapter.
No, I interpreted them as the price, right? That he's going to do something with those objects, and that's the price that is getting. Because again, the wishes were to be rid of the Aes Sedai forever,
Yep.
and
To be rid of the
two
Aes
other
Sedai and
things.
the power, to have the holes in his memories filled in, and to have a way out to get away from the foxes.
Yeah, I mean, my brain is in such knots after all this timey-wimey Aiel stuff that I'm like, oh, right. And also fox people. And they were a variation on the snake people, which we also have to fit into this mythology, which I got nothing. But I will say I liked the kind of, it reminded me of Scrooge being like, they did it all in one night. It's like, oh, it lasted exactly long enough that he can emerge with the dawn,
Yeah.
fulfilling the prophecy. And it seems like that is what's going to happen. So now, having been reminded of the prophecy at the beginning of the first chapter, I'm very curious to know how he is going to bind them. And given all that you've said tonight, I'm going to go ahead and say it's probably something to do with honor and the fact that he now knows their deep sin.
I would just like to then throw in two kind of subtle references to old things we have read, and then we can take ourselves out of this episode. Number one of the things that Matt was told by the snake people several chapters ago was that he would die and live again. And I don't know whether or not he technically died on that tree, but that may have been a thing that just happened. The other thing that we should know is you were just alluding to what Rand's destiny is. I believe it was a couple of books ago that Moraine was reading some old prophecy that referred to the dragon reborn as breaking his people with the way of the leaf.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
that may be happening sooner than later based on what we have just read. What are your last thoughts on these chapters? And I will let you take us out of this episode because let me tell you, we just fulfilled why I did this podcast. Like, we can stop whenever you want now. I'm good.
We also just definitely made it clear that when we almost recorded a week ago and Tyler was feeling a little under the weather, we should not have gone ahead with a phlegmy, half-voiced Tyler
Yeah.
because we would not have survived that episode with that much Tyler talking. Well, I mean, I will be cheesy and I will just say thank you because I do think I understood a good chunk of that, but I feel much more fulfilled coming out of this conversation and understanding a lot of what's going on a lot better. It does feel like let's call it an inflection point where it's we have now gone from let's lay out a lot of mysteries to let's start answering questions. And maybe Lost is the right reference there,
Yeah.
right? As soon as Lost started figuring out like, oh, I know how long this show's going to be, we're going to start answering some of these things. We got a different kind of momentum and it feels like this inflection point is where we're going to see some major changes. There are a lot of books left, so I'm not ready to say this is like the turning point of the whole series, but it's a strong shift from where we have been to where we're going. And I'm really curious to see what that looks like. That being said, this has to be maybe the longest through the glass columns we've ever had. So I'm going to just say thank you once more. Thank you, listeners. We'd love to hear from you on social media what you thought of this. If you need to listen to this 3 times, then maybe we can listen to it together because I'm going to go through this again at least one more time. So anyway, hey, whatever. Next time, now we know what it means through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.